Thank you, Richard. So I didn't know I was going to be obligated to give a little history of myself, but I'll squeeze that in there since Richard started us off that way. Real pleasure to be here with you this morning. Again, my name is Brad Vieselmeyer. Vieselmeyer, no Vin Diesel, but I actually am not a native of Kern County, just to clear that up. I did grow up in Southern California, went to school here on the West Coast. Started my engagement actually with the oil and gas industry while I was here going to school in San Luis Obispo. Spent some time working here in 2010-14 when the environment was a little different, and I've spent some time both in Texas, Gulf of Mexico, and other parts around the world, getting to experience other production environments. I would say some people ask me why come back to Kern County. One of the questions that I receive most, the other one I guess would be, do you actually live here? The answer to that is yes, and the answer to the question on why I came back to Kern County to live and work here is frankly sitting out in the audience today. I think what I gleaned this morning from a lot of the presentations, there's a lot of fantastic people in Kern County that have figured out that their energy future is in their hands, and they are key pieces of the puzzle that need to come together to secure that energy future. And it's not easy. It's going to be a difficult thing. I think I heard a lot of open acknowledgement about that this morning. That's fantastic to hear. I'm going to try and paint a little bit of a backdrop to some of the themes that you may have heard this morning on mix, why mix is important, balance, collaboration, some of the market factors that may be driving our energy future. I did real quickly before we get going on content. I apologize I wasn't able to make the dinner last night. My son had an event and needed to be at that event with him. He did give me some advice this morning. He said, "Dad, what are you doing tomorrow?" And I told him what event I was going to be at and was going to get the opportunity to speak. And he gave me two pieces of advice. This is a 13-year-old, fantastic young kid. He said, well, first, Dad, don't pull a George Washington. He's a history buff, and I'm totally clueless. Said, what in the world do you mean by that? He said, well, George Washington's first inauguration, he totally blew it. He said he fumbled his speech. He didn't know his content. It was horrible. And I'm sitting here going, oh, geez, thanks, Garen. This is not the type of pep talk that Dad was looking for at going to an engagement tomorrow morning. But he gave me another piece of advice that I thought was really insightful for a 13-year-old. And he said, people just want to have a discussion. And so I'll do my best to give some context and discussion maybe behind some of the market factors here that influence our future. Okay, let's see. All right. So first, before we start into what does the future look like, very valuable to think about and analyze what's happened in our past, right? What does the rear view mirror look like for our industry, clarifying and understanding challenges and uncertainties that may lie in our future. The chart that you're seeing here is a representation of energy demand, right? So this is global total primary energy demand, right? So this is the need of the world from an energy perspective. This is a system that has been under continual change and evolution throughout the course of time. It's very interesting. It's also very, very complex. You see, since 1870, it's been a story of growth, right? And some periods of time, significant growth, particularly where you see there in the 1960s. We'll talk about why that occurred. You see a little dip. The only reduction that you see was in 2020, and that's a result of the pandemic, right? So think about the amount of change that occurred in that period of time. It was drastic for people directly. It felt like things came to a screeching halt. And yet, look at the slight reduction that you saw in global energy demand around the world. It's relatively insignificant compared to the whole. So a significant piece of data that tells us how large the system is, how important it is, and how stable actually it can be. We're going to talk about two primary factors that drive energy demand around the globe. And this is not not rocket science. You can go find this about anywhere. It makes complete sense. The first one is total population. People need energy, right? And back in 1870, you had a total world population of a little over 1 billion people. Now we're just over 7, okay? So significant growth there. You can see two things here. One is that energy demand, the slide that I just showed previously, matches pretty accurately, right, with what we're showing from a population perspective. The second thing that you may see in this is the change, which we'll get into when we get into mix, right? And that's what happened in the 1960s. Second piece, or second influencer in overall energy demand is income growth, right? So as personal wealth, as income grows, so does the demand for goods and services in people's lives. As people have additional income, they want to improve the quality of their life. And a lot of those things, a lot of us in the developed world take for granted, right? So some of these things as simple as heating and cooling your home, transportation, additional vehicles, a vehicle. Think about folks that don't have a vehicle in their family and would like to get to a job that is away from their residence that they need to get to improve the quality of their life, or getting a child to school that is outside, their immediate boundary condition. When people have that income available to them, they seek to improve their lives and the lives of their families. Another interesting nugget that I'll share, and this kind of goes back to a statement that was made by the Boeing CEO in 2017, and it was a depiction of this income change that we expect to occur here. Only 20% of the world population has actually gotten on an airplane in their lives. 20%. You and I think that's completely normal to get on an airplane multiple times, sometimes in a week for business travel. That's completely normal. 80% of the population of the world has never stepped on an airplane at all in their lifetimes. So, energy demand is going to correlate with income growth over time. It has. We've seen that track. It's a major driver towards our future. Okay. This chart shows distribution of that energy supply or demand, right? If you want to look at it that way. It's changed over time. So if you go back, to 1870 there that you see on the left-hand side, a world dominated by burning wood, mainly biomass. Additionally, you see that in green, and then coal just above it, right? So those are the relative forms of energy that were available at the time. That persisted until you get into the 1960s, where you actually saw significant population growth occur, and then you see the introduction of oil and gas on a commercial scale. When you look at this chart, the main takeaway here is the history of energy is not one of replacement or displacement, it's one of addition, right? The world has needed more energy over time. The world will likely continue to have a higher energy demand in our future. In fact, we're using more biomass today than we did back in 1870, even though there are alternate forms of energy readily available. The comment about oil and gas prevalence in the 1960s is also an important one. So, obviously, that was not the advent of the oil and gas industry, right? That was nearly 100 years prior to this change. So recognize it took nearly 100 years for the world's infrastructure, not all the world's infrastructure, mainly some more developed nations, to actually be capable of changing the energy mix and using alternate forms of energy. 100 years, and yet, arguably, if you go back to the time period when oil and gas were discovered and the industry began, it was a much, much better source of energy. Higher energy density, much more easily transportable fuel, and yet it took 100 years for it to become commercial in scale and significant on this map. So, change doesn't necessarily happen overnight. All right, so looking towards the future here, both factors that we just discussed, global population, this is a depiction from United Nations on the left, and gross domestic product globally from International Energy Agency on the right. A couple of takeaways here. It's probably pretty obvious for you, but I'll go ahead and assert them anyway. United Nations expects another 2 billion people over the course of the next 30 years. That's roughly 30% growth in global population. That is not insignificant. And while this population growth isn't necessarily evenly distributed around the globe, it's mainly centered in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, also areas where we do expect income growth to increase over time. That's a reflection of the chart on the right. We expect more people in those growing populations to move into the middle class. So some fundamentals behind energy demand. We have a growing population, and you're going to have growing incomes around the world that are likely to drive greater demand for energy. All right, so snapshot here, scaling it up to just the last 20 years. You can see the reduction there during the pandemic, and if you fast forward here to predictions of the future, and Ken, I think, referenced this in his comments, talking about predictions of the future. Lots of folks that get involved in making those predictions. There's 4 major categories that you see here from International Energy Agency. These are predictions. These are predictions that incorporate both our history in population growth and personal income growth, and expectations for those in the future. So there's trend information used in developing these forecasts. Remember, it's very, very difficult to make long-term predictions like this in a simple environment, and I would argue this is a much more complex environment to try and make predictions in, right? So you see ranges also, some bands around both those upper and lower trajectories that try and signify that. Also incorporated in projections here are assumptions around efficiency, right? So we talked a little bit about both maybe conventional base business here and also renewables going forward. Expectation for those current energy sources to become more efficient, plus what may be available to me from efficient energy sources in the future. So all those work into some of these predictions, some more readily available than others. The one piece of information to note when looking at these predictions is the majority of forecasts all assume greater energy demand in the future, right? And I think Ken alluded to that. They drive for growth. So if you look inside those forecasts, so there were 4 different profiles that you saw on the previous slide. There's an added bar on the left of the distribution on those trajectories, which is 2019. Basically, this is showing energy distribution based on those assumptions with those trajectories, right? So coal and gray on the bottom, the blue is oil, red natural gas, and you get into lower carbon and renewables in the green. The light green that you see a relatively rapid expansion on is wind and solar. So 2019 was the last full year really pre-pandemic. That's a good benchmark to base some information on. You know, recognize at that point in time about 80% of the world was fueled by fossil fuel at the time. So the trajectories on the right, so the bar charts on the right, particularly the immediate right there, both stated policy and accelerated policy scenarios, both depict growth in energy demand, right? So there's going to be some assertions on what that spread looks like, but those are more probable outcomes, I guess less predictive or efficiency assumptions in those. Both call for growth. Other scenarios further to the right, and you still see a distribution, a mix of energy, even in those distributions, those trajectories. Just keep in mind, they still do not get to a single or reduced amount of energy sources. They still require a mix, right? While the green does reflect that you will have greater electrification in the future, just keep in mind, not all energy sectors are easily electrified. That is certainly a challenge for heavier industries. Okay, so what drives that distribution? What drives whether we have large red bars, blue bars, green bars? Generally driven by three factors: technology, policy, and customer preference. All of those have important decisions that will impact what the energy mix looks like in the future, whether one form of energy is used or another. I'll call your attention to the chart on the left. You'll see a gray line there. You see some variation of it at the top, a little bit hard to see. It actually represents technology adoption of smartphones in North America. So what you see is rapid adoption, and I think most of us, probably all of us in this room, are carrying smartphones today. I think all of us in this room would probably also agree that smartphones have increased in cost significantly over time and capabilities. I'm shocked the last time my son asked for a different smartphone, I about fell over backwards at how much it cost. Why is that? Customers see preference and features as something valuable to them. So technology adoption has a lot to do with what the customer values going forward. It meets our needs better than other alternatives. It meets our needs maybe better than what we even saw as computers, desktop computers in the past. I can walk around with it in my hand. Technology adoption is a huge influencer on what that energy looks like in the future. Alternately, if you see the blue line there on the left, that represents dishwashers. Now, if you're in my household, dishwashers are extremely important, right? I got kids, they make a mess. Either I'm doing it, or I'm trying to get them to do it, or it's going in the dishwasher. The reality is the population, right, the world consumers don't see as much value. You do not see the same level of technology adoption in dishwashers as you do smartphones, right? That difference, that preference plays a huge impact on what we're going to see in the future. Technology adoption, the rate of technology adoption will affect it. Interesting, last year, estimated sales of electric vehicles was 6.6 million worldwide. Any guesses on how many SUVs, conventionally powered, were sold during that same time period? Any guesses? Yeah, 35, a little over 35 million. Right? So, you need to put some things in context. While there is technology adoption, rate of technology adoption can certainly drive the pace of technology development and consumer preference in the future. Another factor, balance, supply and demand balance. I heard some great discussion in the room this morning on we need all of it. And I think the room is correct. We're going to need all of it. When you look at the demand side, I think we have more challenge in our future than maybe we recognize. And I would say the will of people to improve the lives of their families is pretty strong. The transition won't necessarily happen overnight. We're experiencing that now. It takes work. It takes research. It takes planning. It takes funding. It takes investment. It does not happen overnight. During that period of transition, it is absolutely critical to keep supply and demand of existing sources of energy in balance. So what you see here on the screens is actually a depiction of Europe, both domestic production that's occurring right now and demand in that region. Not a whole lot of variation, relatively stable, but you do see this reduction, over the last several years as they change some specific energy policies to move away from natural gas production. What's happened since, frankly, is a significant price spike for consumers there in the natural gas. That is the main source of energy for Europe. And I know there's current events, obviously, that have highlighted this, that we're all aware of. What does it actually look like for a consumer there? Imagine, something that costs you $100 a month suddenly goes up to $500 a month, and not in your necessarily direct control. That's a big impact on families. That's a huge impact to consumers. Supply and demand balance through transitions is absolutely critical. In more developed and affluent countries, counties, it can feel more like a nuisance. They can work their way through it. It's hardship, but manageable. In places around the globe that they don't necessarily have that same level of affluence, there can be significant consequences, life consequences for people directly. So we've talked a little bit about energy transition here this morning, and I wanted to maybe reinforce a couple of things that I did hear and how Chevron looks at our energy future. I know the panel was fantastic, talked mainly about the right side of this diagram that you see here, but I also heard the discussion around balance. We're going to need a lot of energy in the future. You have existing forms of energy that we know how to do very, very well, and we are going to need to make a transition to a lower carbon future. There's opportunity on both sides of that equation. One is our existing operations, the existing things that we know how to do. We're actually pretty good at figuring out how to do those more efficiently and effectively. And while the size of the prize may not necessarily be as large as what could be on the right side of this screen, there's opportunity. While we're, I would say, a leader in GHG emissions as a company, we've still put forward targets in our operations, our existing upstream operations especially, to reduce our carbon footprint around the globe. The right side of the slide here we've spoken quite a bit about, and that's investing in future renewables. A lot of discussion on carbon capture and storage. Hydrogen is one that we have not discussed in depth, something that we are aiming at, and I would say when you look at Kern County and its position in the state, its connectedness with both north and south markets. We were talking about pipeline infrastructure a little bit early. It's in a very strategic position, not just for carbon capture and storage, but other energy forms that need to be distributed to markets. So a significant amount of investment in both of these. You've probably seen our announcements on the magnitude of that investment, $10 billion between now and 2028. And that is split between both our conventional business and our renewables. So the panel went into some depth on specific applications. I heard a fantastic comment. I can't remember who said it in that session, and it was really about application. And this is where it's exciting to see Kern County from a position standpoint, is application can drive direction. It can drive policy. It can help us understand what policy may need to be, and it influences people that are part of the energy mix. There's nothing better than to prove something to drive belief in a population, right, or provide hope for them in the future. What's exciting about what I see happening here in Kern County is the application. In fact, I just landed back in Kern County not too long ago, and one of the first observations that I had was the majority of our Chevron New Energy's work, I would say the heart of some of our technology development, the incubation, I think that Garth may have mentioned earlier, it's happening right here. The majority of our horsepower is actually focused on leveraging the skills, the assets that we have, the know-how that we have here with our current business to drive future business. And I would expect that's not uncommon for others in the room. I think it's a fantastic opportunity for the county to lead in this space. After being here for a few hours this morning, I think the folks in the room have what it takes to do some of those things that we discussed in the collaboration space to make it happen. A couple of projects we didn't get to go over, just to highlight them. Multiple going on, some that are in permitting stage, some that are in direct field install or actual pilot phase. There's a couple, first kind of commercial scale carbon capture project happening out in McKittrick. Fantastic opportunity. if successful, this looks like about 200 tons of CO2 a day that we can capture and remove out of the system. That is in flight right now. Savante Carbon Capture Project, which is happening right in Kern River, really looking at that post-combustion point emission that was referenced earlier, how to concentrate those emissions so you have an efficient injection stream on capture. So some great technology advancements happening. A couple of others I won't dwell on that are in the hopper in the planning stage, one in permitting today. But there's one other that I wanted to mention because I knew we hadn't talked about hydrogen a little bit, and that is hydrogen co-firing opportunity that's happening with turbines in a cogen facility out in the west side of our operations. So there's an opportunity for us not only to utilize hydrogen as a new business going forward, there's also an opportunity to utilize that hydrogen in our own assets, our existing assets, to actually improve what I showed on the left side of one of the prior slides on improving our own conventional business lines. Multiple assets that we referenced earlier that are highly valuable, opportunity to develop technology. I think we have some of the right people, like I said, in the room to help us drive that technology forward, and it's exciting to watch it being done, and I expect it to grow here in Kern County in the years to come. So a little bit of a wrap up here. There is going to be an energy transition, and it's obvious to me that people have acknowledged that is coming, and we need to be the resources behind doing that in a responsible manner. It will take time. It will not happen overnight. History has probably taught us some lessons in that are worth paying attention to. Supply and demand for existing sources of energies needs to be balanced through that transition. It's essential to energy security. It's essential to affordability of energy for people around the globe. The world is going to need energy in many forms. Many forms. The United Nations scientists that we talked a little bit about earlier, that Ken was referencing, that are deep in this intergovernmental panels on climate change. If you look at the scenarios, they've studied about 90 different scenarios that meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. They all envision multiple forms of energy throughout the future. The reality is we're going to need about everything we can get. Achieving a lower carbon intensity in the forms of energy that we have today for the energy that will be required for decades to come needs to be part of our priorities. It's not just new growth. The change that we need to make, the transition that we refer to, it's not something that's going to be accomplished by one company, one organization, one set of resources. It is complex. And I think I heard Alexi mention earlier, it's a level of collaboration that we have not really had to experience before. And I think he's spot on. We're going to learn some things along the way here, and it's important for us to learn quickly. It will take policymakers, it will take engineers, it will take scientists, it will take operators, it will take investors to make sure that we can progress that change in a responsible way. The nature of the challenge is multifaceted, certainly not solvable by one group. I can tell you I am more encouraged than ever when talking about this topic after listening to the discussion and talking to folks in the room this morning. This is has been a fantastic county and place in the state from an energy production historically. I think it's also the hub of our future energy growth, our future energy vision in the future. The people in this room are the ones that will make it happen. I encourage you to reach beyond what you're typically comfortable with in collaboration. I thought it was a great question earlier in what does that look like. I don't know if we always know exactly what that looks like. I think what we probably do know is it doesn't look like what we've done historically. It's going to have to be something different. I appreciate all of you being here in this room for this event, learning, absorbing, trying to understand both from your organization's perspective and personally what we need to do different. I can't give you the roadmap on what that looks like. That's something that we're going to have to figure out collectively. But very, very energized that we have the right people in the room, in the county, to make that a reality in the future. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate your attention. Hopefully this was helpful for you.